when the prairie winds howled like a homesick fiddle and snowflakes the size of flapjacks buried wagon wheels by morning, families on the American frontier had to get creative to stay warm, not just the wrap an extra scarf kind of warm. We're talking life or frostbite warm. Now, heating a Conestoga wagon during a winter blizzard wasn't exactly a task for the faint of heart or the weak of lungs. You couldn't just crank up a thermostat or order a heated blanket off whichever primeval version of Amazon there was. Likely some guy named Jedediah with a sled. So what did keep them warm out there? Let's start with the obvious, the fire. A cheery, crackling bonfire was the heartthrob of frontier warmth. But you couldn't exactly keep a bonfire in the wagon unless you were particularly fond of spontaneous combustion. So at night, families would bank the fire before bed, piling ashes on the glowing embers to keep them insulated. This allowed a quick revival come, morning, like stretching a pretzel dough and still finding it elastic. Except, this was heat and survival. Families would cook their evening meal over the fire, usually something unimaginably bland, like bean stew or salt pork that had a flavor somewhere between dusty leather and elective regret. But the nice side effect of these dishes was condensation, steam, warmth, and just enough glow in the cheeks to keep frostbite from nibbling at your nose. Blankets. Oh, there were blankets. So many blankets. Wool, patched together from whatever was available. Sometimes Cousin Margaret's old Sunday dress was sewn into the underside, floral print and all. And on especially bitter nights, folks slept dressed in every stitch they owned. Mittens on their feet, a bonnet repurposed as a scarf. One man was known to sleep wrapped entirely in his horse's saddle pads, which breached social standards of the day, but honestly, everyone secretly admired the innovation, quietly. And what about the wagons themselves? Well, they weren't exactly insulated. The Conestoga and prairie schooners were built for crossing mountains, big wooden shells with canvas covers. It was like sleeping inside a wooden canoe with a flimsy tarp thrown over top and saying, "All right, everyone, pleasant dreams." To improve their odds, settlers would sometimes dig shallow trenches beneath the wagons, banking dirt and snow around the wheels. The snow, though cold, acted as insulation, trapping what little warmth the human bodies could produce. A snowy hug from Mother Nature herself, laced with mild hypothermia. But the true secret ingredient in frontier warmth was togetherness, and not in the hallmark sense. I mean literal, no personal space body heat. Picture 12 people and possibly a goat, crammed in a single wagon bed no wider than a twin mattress. Children squished between elders, elbows tucked, noses pressed into someone's arm or a pillow made out of dry corn husks. It wasn't glamorous. Romance was entirely theoretical. But they were warm. Sometimes they'd heat rocks by the fire and carry these glowing warm stones into bed with them. Tucked into blankets or placed beneath feet, these little prehistoric radiators stayed warm for hours. There were tales of entire families resting their frozen toes against a shared bedrock, probably muttering sacred gratitude to both geology and desperation. And yes, the rare luxury among frontier sleep accessories, the hot brick. Families traveling with cast iron skillets or Dutch ovens could heat a brick over the coals, wrap it in burlap, and slide it under their straw bedding. A bedtime gift that smelled faintly of ash and asparagus, depending on what they cooked for supper. There were also stories, often exaggerated around an evening fire, of one traveler who tried to keep a small campfire going inside the wagon by placing it in a pot over some stones. He was lovingly nicknamed Charcoal Pete after the incident. He survived. The wagon didn't. The goat was inconsolable. So there they were, families huddled together in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by white hills of silence, warmed by ambition, ingenuity, and the tang of singed wool. Children fell asleep to the quiet hiss of snow against canvas and the tired mumblings of adults playing cards by lantern light, the flicker bouncing shadows off their frozen provisions. And now, as your own eyelids grow heavy like buffalo-hide door flaps, maybe you can almost hear the wind outside that old wooden wagon and feel the warm brick tucked beneath your feet, soothing and strange. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Tonight, let the wind blow and the canvas sway, because in the snug corners of dream wagons, the snow can't touch you here. Imagine it's 1847 and you're somewhere in the middle of nowhere, which in pioneer cartography generally meant somewhere between a place ominously called Lone Tree Creek and another equally unsettling location named simply Desolation Gulch. The wind slices across the plains like a wet slap of frozen cornbread, and your wagon, which is less luxury camper and more wooden box on wheels, offers all the insulation of a strainer. The great American westward migration wasn't exactly known for its five-star accommodations. A wagon family, say the Farnsworths, fictional but entirely plausible, had to get rather creative when the mercury dropped. With canvas flapping, oxen shivering, and small children turning blue at the knees, survival wasn't so much thrilling as it was a nightly negotiation with Jack Frost himself. So how did these grim prairie tales avoid becoming actual grim prairie endings? For starters, they took the phrase body heat to a whole new level. Men, women, children, and occasionally the family dog named something like Rufus or Molly snuggled shoulder to hip under layers of quilt stitched long before the journey began. Quilting, you see, wasn't just a hobby passed down from Aunt Minerva. It was armor. Rough spun cloth, stuffed with wool or cotton batting, was expertly layered like a textile lasagna. Early pioneers didn't just sleep in these quilts. They cocooned, nested, and burrowed. And if you think that sounds too cozy to have been practical, keep in mind that people were out there sleeping in head-to-toe wool underwear, under quilts made of other people's wool underwear. Nothing, and I mean nothing, went to waste. Mittens were refashioned from old socks. Stockings turned into makeshift balaclavas. And it's not entirely exaggerated to say that if a sheep died, it might get more use post-mortem than it ever did while it was alive. Now let's talk wagon insulation, which is generous phrasing for what amounted to piling everything you owned against the sides until the wind had to actually knock. Flour sacks, carpet remnants, buffalo robes, which were less decorative throws and more massive, smelly, bear-like blankets, were all pressed into action. Some even rigged up a second layer of canvas on the inside walls, creating what could barely be described as double glazing pioneer edition. And oh, the innovation didn't stop there. The wagon's iron stove. Because yes, some families managed to lug a small, squat, and annoyingly clanky cast iron stove, might be lit if fuel allowed, which of course it usually didn't. Wood was a precious commodity on the open plains, and while buffalo chips may sound like a snack, they were actually cowpie cousins pressed into use as fuel. Essentially, lighting your stove sometimes meant politely suggesting someone go forage for a well-aged poop disc. For warmth during the night, folks turned not only to quilts and cuddles, but also to the humble, warming stone, a large rock, heated in the campfire embers, then wrapped in burlap or a bit of muslin and tucked under the blankets at the foot of the bed. This radiated cozy heat, though there was, of course, the occasional morning surprise when the stone had burned a hole straight through the ticking mattress. Pioneers had many words for frustration, but char-broiled bedding was a particularly reserved curse muttered through frozen lips. Oh, and then there was the one strategy no one wanted to discuss: sleeping in spoons, reverse position sleeping, human origami. Pioneer families arranged themselves like a woven lattice of limbs, pressed together for warmth and just trying not to breathe directly into one another's frozen noses. Personal space, in case you're wondering, had to be packed and left behind in Missouri. But perhaps the coziest secret of all was the sheer, stubborn optimism that tomorrow's sun might rise golden and melt the frost off the wagon canvas. They'd listen to the wolves howling like banshees in the distance, tuck their faces into a cousin's hand-me-down nightshirt, and dream of a fire crackling somewhere, real or imagined. And in the hush of that long night, with stars winking between clouds and wind creaking through the prairie grass, one of the Farnsworth children, a squirmy, tow-headed creature named Emmett, recounted the family's new nightly tradition, trading made-up stories about what it would be like to sleep in a featherbed back east. The whole wagon eventually fell into a rhythm, lulled half to dream by warmth, closeness, and the assurance that between buffalo chips and Aunt Minerva's underpants quilt, tomorrow might just be another day survived. Softly now, as the night deepens and the wind subsides into the cautious hush before dawn, we begin to wonder, what did a pioneer breakfast look like when you woke up still wearing half your bedding? Let's drift there next, as dusk melted, dusk, behind the snowy plains, and the wind began to hum its nightly lullaby across the canvas roofs of covered wagons. The challenge was not just keeping warm, but doing so in a moving wooden box surrounded by frozen emptiness. These settlers weren't casually glamping. They were pioneering westward in the full definition of the word uncomfortable. Now, before we romanticize this too much, let's get something straight. Wagon families were not nestled in Sherpa-lined sleeping bags with heated blankets. No, they were layered in scratchy wool, cloaked in hand-stitched quilts, and braced against the chill with pure grit, lard, and, when luck permitted, a strategically sassy cow named Bessie, parked unreasonably close to the wagon. You see, warmth wasn't something you turned on. It was something you plotted. First came the fire, essential yet problematic. Open the flaps of your wagon and let a little flame inside, and suddenly you're not camping, you're flambeing. So unless you had a cast iron stove cleverly installed, more on that in a moment, you were out front, stomping snow around a fire pit, hoping your eyebrows didn't freeze off before your beans got warm. But those clever few, yes, the fancy types, managed to wedge tiny wood-burning stoves into their wagons. Imagine squeezing a fireplace into a glorified bread box on wheels. These stoves weren't OSHA-approved nor pleasing to the face, but when temperatures plunged below freezing, they became the most beloved part of the wagon, after perhaps Grandma Ethel, who still knew how to make biscuits rise at altitude. Of course, using a stove inside a wagon was less cozy and more mildly Russian roulette. Sparks could lead to smoldering canvas. Smoke had a tendency to linger. And even when things went well, the heat distribution was eccentric. Feet might be toasty while your upper body pondered hypothermia. Ever tried to sleep with one foot in July and your scalp in Siberia? That was wagon life. Bedding became a second front in the war on winter. Featherbeds, quilts, and wool blankets were family heirlooms, not just because they were cherished, but because they literally saved your life. Layers, layers, and still more layers. If you've ever put on 6 pairs of socks, 3 undershirts, 2 shawls, and a buffalo robe just to go to bed, congratulations, you might be a 19th century pioneer. Buffalo robes, speaking of which, won the Winter War MVP award year after year. These luxurious, if slightly smelly hides were thicker than a prairie preacher's sermon and wider than Aunt Matilda's opinions. Dried, processed, and sometimes gifted with a rough embroidered family crest, usually involving a hand in prayer or a suspiciously large chicken, these robes could hold in heat like a Dutch oven. Sometimes the entire family would sleep like a pile of puppies, everyone stacked together for warmth. Cozy, yes. Romantic? Not quite. Imagine 4 toddlers, 2 parents, 1 grandparent with questionable snoring acoustics, and an anxious collie, all squished under a buffalo robe. Still, it beat shivering in silence. Barely. Then there were the unlikely heroes, the hot brick and the heated potato. Truly. Bricks warmed by the campfire were wrapped in cloth and tucked at the foot of the bedding. Potatoes, baked by firelight and then thrown beneath quilts, served double duty. Night-warming fuel and cold breakfast in the morning. Dual-purpose coziness in one starchy package. Clothing too played its part. Pioneers slept in their long underwear, heavy socks, and if they could manage it without strangling themselves, scarves or hoods. Some even wore multiple hats, because when it's 10 below zero with sleet rattling your canvas walls like a spiteful percussion ensemble, fashion is not the point. Survival was. And yet, in all this effort to stay warm, there was something deeply communal about shivering together under a patchwork quilt, whispering, stories, sharing body heat, and listening to the wind croon its bitter lullaby. The cold pushed them closer, quite literally. Eventually, sleep would settle in, usually after the 3rd retelling of how Pa wrestled that winter raccoon away from the food stash. The fire embers would sink low, and the old wagon, cold and creaky, would hold its breath while the blizzard wailed on outside, uninvited, but not unexpected. And somewhere, as dawn tiptoed softly toward the horizon, a tiny ember in the makeshift stove flickered, and one brave soul began to think about breakfast, or at least the potato under their foot. But before they could wiggle free from the mountain of quilts and elbows, the wind gave a special groan against the canvas and reminded the family that the storm wasn't quite done yet. Still, warmth would come, not from stoves or bricks alone, but from determination, clever tools, and a little something mariners used too, surprisingly enough. On the bitter prairie, wines of a November night, buried deep in the folds of the American frontier, warmth was not just comfort. It was a matter of basic survival, and perhaps the 19th century's most elusive luxury. While the blizzards outside spiraled like flour in a baker's dream, inside the covered wagons, wagon families employed a rather unphotogenic, but impressively effective, system of human ingenuity and livestock-assisted thermodynamics. Yes, dear listener, when it came to keeping warm, these families weren't above spooning, with cows. Let us first pull back the canvas flap and peek inside a typical settler's wagon. The expectation might be a snug Lincoln log dollhouse of fluff-lined walls and pipe-smoking gentlemen under patchwork quilts. In reality, these wagons were less like portable inns and more like wooden shoeboxes with wheels. The prairie schooners, compact and minimal, were technically too narrow to sleep in comfortably for a whole family. But comfort was a latecomer to most frontier plans. So instead, many families, after a hard day of bumping along the rough ground at the dizzying speed of 2 miles per hour, would disembark for the night and set up a sleeping arrangement cleverly referred to in historical diaries as wherever we collapse. This often meant unfolding oilcloths and buffalo hides near the wagon, where a fire was carefully built, radiating warmth against the wind in a noble, if not particularly successful, battle. Firewood was scarcer than treasure in many parts of the Great Plains, so dung was pressed into service. That's right. Buffalo chips, aka sun-dried animal droppings, were collected lovingly by children and proudly burned. There was nothing hypocritical about a family who told their children to pick up poop all day and then thanked them for keeping their toes from freezing off at night. But on those bone-chilling nights when even a buffalo chip fire couldn't hold the line against the frost, families turned inward, and sometimes downward, to the breathing, braying, glorified bed warmers, otherwise known as livestock. A cow's body temperature is roughly 101.5 degrees, pleasantly toasty when the ambient prairie temperature is trying to murder you in your sleep. In certain desperate situations, families tethered their animals close by, or in very rare but real cases, brought smaller livestock like goats inside the wagon itself. Goats, it turns out, are excellent at chewing your bedding and farting dramatically. Two surprisingly effective heat generators. Children were also valued for their insulation capacity. That's the scientific term, of course. In emotional terms, cuddle puddling became an art form. Children slept wedged between parents, beneath layers of quilts, blankets, and the occasional ill-tempered great aunt. Families rotated sleeping positions to share body heat, transforming themselves into writhing little stove systems, achieving just enough warmth to keep frostbite at a polite distance. Now, quilts deserve an honorable mention here, the household's unsung heroes. These were not the airy doilies sold in curated modern boutiques for $300 and decorative purposes only. Prairie quilts were thick beasts stuffed with wool, cotton batting, or, in a pinch, anything vaguely insulative that wasn't moving, sometimes even old clothing, horsehair, or shredded documents, which gives a whole new meaning to sleeping on your taxes. Women, often the keepers of the patchwork arts, sewed throughout the off hours by lamplight, forging quiet weapons against the cold. The layers of patchwork weren't just warm, they were stories, stitched reminders of other blankets, other homes, even older relatives' worn dresses. A pioneer quilt was like a family album you could nap under, and you better believe it got heavy, physically and metaphorically. For some travelers, warmth also came in a bottle. Whiskey, often passed around in cold camps, was less about the accurate application of science and more about coping with the knowledge that science wasn't currently on the prairie. While alcohol might trick the brain into feeling warm, it didn't actually raise body temperature, something our ancestors consistently disregarded while toasting beside steamy manure fires with flushed cheeks and questionable decisions. But the true warmth that sustained these wandering families came less from flames or insulation and more from simple togetherness. Shared hardship has a way of making a huddle feel sacred. Under canvas roofs and against ice-kissed winds, laughter, lullabies, and the occasional grumble about soggy mittens-bound people in warmth deeper than tinder. And that, perhaps, is the most important heating system history ever forgot to patent. Now, while the fire crackles low and the goats settle into their dream-filled snoring, Let's quietly step outside the wagon again. The night air stings the nose, but the sky, the sky, is heavy with stars, each one a silent witness to our oddly cozy past. There's another secret waiting just down the trail, curled under the next hill, where history waits sleepy-eyed and wrapped in a buffalo robe. Out under skies that held more stars than answers, families traveling westward in the 1800s discovered one of the many unsung truths of frontier life. Warmth was its own kind of currency. And when the bitter bite of a winter blizzard swept across the plains, that currency became scarce, measured not in degrees, but in how many fingers you could still feel by morning. It turns out, the pioneers didn't just pack dreams and cast iron skillets. They also packed an astonishing amount of wool. Wool socks, wool trousers, wool blankets thick enough to muffle not just the cold, but also the sounds of a snoring tent mate with digestion issues from too many beans. Now, contrary to many modern depictions, those covered wagons weren't crawling with amenities. There was no mini fireplace in the corner, no plush mattress to curl upon, and definitely no electric heated mattress pad with 3 settings and a safety shutoff. A pioneer night during a snowstorm was more economically snug. Imagine a mobile wooden closet with wheels, packed tighter than a barrel of pickles attending a cotillion. When temperatures plunged, wagon families employed a method known, quite scientifically, as everyone huddle and pretend this is fine. Children were tucked in between parents like tiny biscuits between skillet-warmed cornbread. Extra blankets were layered over everyone in a system that resembled the construction of lasagna. Meat, blanket, child, blanket, parent, blanket, grief, and then another blanket. Some families smartly planned ahead, bringing buffalo robes, those cavernous, heavy pelts that had enough insulative power to cause spontaneous naps. These weren't light TV blanket affairs. A buffalo robe laid across your body meant you weren't moving for at least 8 hours, or until your oldest child needed to go outside and forgot how doors work. Aside from layering every available fabric known to humans, the pioneers also embraced the primal magic of hot rocks. Stones were heated up in the coals of the campfire. Yes, even in a blizzard, fire was fostered with the tenderness of a baby chick, and then wrapped in cloth or tucked into small sacks. These makeshift prehistoric heating pads were slipped into beds before anyone crawled in, gently roasting toes and warming stubborn corners. It was one of the few pleasures of the night, sliding into stiff wagon bedding and discovering a pleasantly toasty rock by your shins, instead of, say, your brother's cold feet. Interestingly, some clever souls employed stovepipes running through their covered wagons. If you're imagining central heating, let's kindly redirect you. These were small, often homemade iron stoves that fit inside the wagon's canvas cover. And yes, they were as safe as juggling flaming raccoons. But desperate times call for dramatic ironwork. The stoves burned buffalo chips, those delightful dried segments of animal excrement collected during the day with as much reverence as firewood in Vermont. Pioneers didn't always have trees, but by golly, the buffalo were generous. And when supplies ran thin, when even the driest of dung cakes had been reduced to ash, families fell back on that most reliable of all human technologies, storytelling. Not just for amusement, but for emotional warmth. The tales woven beneath thick quilts and heavier lids reminded everyone, young and old, that they weren't just trudging through snow and wind. They were building myths, tiny flickering lights of hope and humor in the blizzard-dark prairie. You could almost hear it, Pa spinning a yarn about the snowstorm of '41. while Ma stitched the busted mitten with thread barely visible in lantern light. Children nestled into each other, eyes heavy, the storm, howling outside like an impatient wolf trying to RSVP for dinner. But inside that canvas dome, the air pulsed with stories, laughter, buffalo robe farts, and the kind of sleepy togetherness that could melt even a Siouxland frostbite. Not every night was survivable, but many were. And those who braved them weren't just fighting winter, they were teaching themselves to be fires in the snow. Speaking of fire, the next morning's breakfast required one, and sometimes building that first flame was as dramatic as a Shakespearean duel, involving soggy kindling, numb fingers, and an argument over who misplaced the flint. But for now, all was quiet inside the wagon, except for the slow, soft exhale of breathing bodies wrapped in furs and dreams. And soon, one more trick for staying warm would emerge, not of wool or stove, but of good old pioneer stubbornness mixed with a pinch of ingenuity and a generous dollop of desperation. By the time the sun dipped behind the jagged edges of the Rockies, with its last golden sigh breathing across the frozen grasslands, most wagon families were beginning the sacred evening ritual of not freezing into people-shaped ice sculptures. Sophisticated modern solutions, central heating, microfleece, and heated floors were conspicuously absent. Instead, our tenacious trail travelers relied on what we now generously classify as creative discomfort management. To begin with, warmth was a group effort. Nobody traveled westward alone unless they had a particularly nasty habit of talking to their horse more than people. The buddy system wasn't just about companionship, it was about body heat. Families, neighbors, and even that oddly quiet bachelor with 3 suspiciously identical dogs would all huddle together in wagons or tents like pioneers of the world's least glamorous cuddle party. The Conestoga wagon, that iconic prairie schooner, might seem like a cozy rolling cabin from the outside, but in reality it leaked cold air with the efficiency of a sieve made of frozen sadness. The canvas top offered minimal insulation, so families layered it with scrap quilts, buffalo hides, or any other fabric treasure they'd been guilt-tripped into bringing by Aunt Hattie. Buffalo robes were particularly prized. Shaggy, thick, and slightly musty, they served both as bedding and mobile heating systems. They looked like old rugs and felt like portable saunas. And yes, they smelled like the inside of a matted beard. But on nights when the wind howled like a homesick werewolf, nobody was much in the mood for luxury. Now, let us turn our gaze to the humble bed warmer. Not a particularly affectionate spouse, but a more literal copper pan filled with smouldering coals. These little fiery frisbees would be gently tucked under bedding before sleep, gently toasted like a human panini. Of course, if handled carelessly, they could also set entire sleeping quarters on fire, instantly warming everyone in a terminal way. So in practice, many families opted for the safer heating alternative: livestock proximity. Sleeping near animals wasn't just a farm kid's rite of passage, it was a strategic maneuver. Oxen, mules, and even the occasional smug goat were living heaters. As long as one could forgive the rhythmic chorus of chewing, snoring, and occasional barnyard flatulence, lying near livestock could mean the difference between waking up shivering or not waking up at all. Some families slept with animals inside the wagon. Yes, Daisy the milk cow got to share the blanket if it meant everyone lived till breakfast. And what of clothing, you ask? They didn't change it often. Honestly, the average wool shirt had 2 seasons, wearing and entirely crusted, but the bulk was the goal. Layers were everything. wool undergarments, flannel petticoats, thick socks, and those peculiar hand-knit mittens missing thumbs, all stacked together like a wearable onion. The myth of hardy, pioneers striding through snowfall in linen dresses and open vests, is largely romantic nonsense. Warmth was pink cheeks and tight belts stuffed with old newspaper. Indeed, paper, especially from discarded letters or pages ripped from sermons considered uninspiring, made for inexpensive insulation. Tucked between shirts or glued, yes glued, into makeshift wallpaper linings for wagon walls, paper helped trap precious body heat. It also, incidentally, led to some hilariously accidental readings during long winter nights. Picture a young child dozing off with the words "Beware ye sinners" faintly pressed against their cheek. Of course, there was also fire, a vital flickering friend. Campfires were carefully tended in the evenings, sometimes stoked through the night by whoever drew the short straw known as the fire watch, an honor shared equally among siblings, grudges notwithstanding. Inside the wagon, the fire was replaced by carefully heated bricks wrapped in cloth placed at foot level. These hand-warmed stones might not have been central heating, but they were cherished like little bedtime miracles. And yet, despite all botanical ingenuity and frontier resourcefulness, freezing nights still seeped in like unwelcome ghosts. Families gathered close. They read to each other. They sang softly, hymns, ballads, and the kind of songs that didn't require impressive pitch. Laughter helped. So did stories, especially the funny ones Grandpa Joe swore were true, but definitely weren't, involving wolves, whiskey, and why he never trusted squirrels. At some point, each night, the chill would finally settle into quiet. Sleep came in layers beneath hides, bricks, goats, and dreams blurred by wood smoke and whispered lullabies. And above them all, the stars, ancient, distant, indifferent, chuckled quietly at the fragile warmth below. Soon, as winter deepened its hold and travelers pressed further westward, another age-old secret emerged, involving one of humankind's least celebrated but most frequent activities, and a very chilly outhouse, somewhere on the icy plains of Nebraska Territory, under a sky inked with winter stars. A rickety wagon creaked at the mercy of a biting wind, the wood shivering along with the people inside. The family within, bundled, burrowed, and braving, had reached that most sacred hour of frontier survival. Bedtime during a blizzard. Now, this wasn't bedtime with quilts neatly turned down and hot cocoa steaming politely on the nightstand. No, this was sleep with icicles threatening to form on one's eyebrows and the faint chance of waking up with a frozen chicken in your lap if it had wandered in for warmth. To endure such frigid misadventures, resourcefulness was less of a virtue and more of a nightly performance art. Let us give credit where it's irrationally due. In an age without thermostats, these families essentially invented the human sandwich. Picture it: bodies layered together, adults curled around children, children squished between dogs and heated bricks. If someone's foot was in your armpit, congratulations. That just meant you were warm. Heating bricks was something of a quiet miracle. Think of it. They'd be placed in the evening fire, the kindling crackling a lullaby of sparks, and left to soak up the heat like sun-deprived sponges. Once full of fire's kindness, the bricks would be carefully wrapped in cloth. An old apron, maybe, or a shirt, whose prime had long since galloped off, and tucked beneath bedding or into boots placed near vulnerable toes. A good brick could hold its warmth long enough to convince your bones they might live to see spring. Of course, the family dog served a similar thermal purpose, whether he liked it or not. While modern pets play fetch and bark at mail carriers, the prairie dog, not the rodent, mind you, the brave mutt that shared your supper and your sour feet, had a full-time job as a living foot warmer. Children often treated him like a fur-covered heating pillow. Parents weren't above using the dog as a buffer against the icy canvas walls either. If a tail in one's face meant not freezing, well then, wag on, little hero. Buffalo robes, stitched thick with memory and musk, often swaddled sleeping forms. These were the all-weather sleeping bags of the West. Heavy, pungent, and capable of flattening a sneeze before it left your body. If someone in the wagon started wheezing, it wasn't always from illness. Sometimes it was just an inhaled tuft of buffalo. Don't worry, completely natural and very warm. Layers were essential, and not just of bedding. Women often retired to sleep retaining most of their day's garments, underthings included. Men too, unless their long johns had developed personalities of their own by then. Linen, wool, flannel. Pajamas were not yet a matter of style. They were a matter of textile fortitude. Children were bundled like over-ambitious sausages, often wrapped in so many shawls and socks that finding their noses took a bit of gentle excavation in the morning. Perhaps the most credit must be given to the nighttime fire itself, the sacred flame. If the family found dry fuel, the fire might be kept smouldering in a cast-iron stove or hearth until daylight. If not, well, then the fire wasn't just a heat source. It was the family therapist, entertainment center, and silent prayer that blizzards come with a snooze button. In some wagons, the heat was so meager, it was said that breath froze in mid-air and fell like powdered sugar on the sleeping heads below. Whether that was true or not didn't really matter. It was a magical image, and one that made it easier to bear the cold. As sleep tiptoed in, cloaked in frost and dreams, the family nestled deeper into their makeshift warmth. Maybe someone whispered an old song, or hummed a lullaby whose verses had been frayed by the wind. Maybe silence reigned instead, broken only by the occasional flick of snow pattering against the canvas, a sound so soft it might have been a dream sneaking into the wagon. And all the while, outside, the storm danced its frozen ballet, unaware that inside a patchwork of bricks, dogs, buffalo robes, and steadfast love had defied it once again. Beyond the windows of stitched canvas and frost-kissed seams, tomorrow waited. And with it, the question of breakfast in such icy conditions. But that's a tale best saved for a warm whisper. Somewhere between the second pot of beans and the third layer of wool socks, wagon families of the 1800s reached a quiet understanding. Survival wasn't just about grit, it was about insulation, and they weren't picky about the source. To grasp how pioneers kept warm on frostbitten nights beneath skies that offered stars but no heat, imagine a canvas-covered wagon, part home, part storage barn, part rolling burrito wrap. The fabric, usually stretched tight, like a banjo string, was made of oiled canvas or thick duck cloth. Hardly luxurious, but with sides dropped and extra patchwork added, it could trap more warmth than a reluctant grandpa's hug. Inside, warmth strategy bordered on tactical genius or sheer improvisation. The first line of defense: bedding, piles of it. Feather-stuffed ticks, woolen quilts, and hand-tied comforters were layered like soggy pancakes, enveloping the sleeping family like moths in a cocoon. If the moth snored, and the cocoon smelled vaguely of lard and pine tar. Children were often nestled together at night, like a bundle of particularly squirmy sausages. They wore knitted nightcaps, flannel long johns, and sometimes, when things got truly desperate, Yesterday's clothing over today's clothing, forming a kind of pioneer lasagna of worn fabric and hope. Now, of course, humans alone don't keep spaces warm, unless they're having a very loud barn dance, or possibly a heated dispute about whether it's supper or dinner. So the cleverer families brought another miracle of Old West engineering along for the journey. Bricks. Yes, bricks. Not for building, but for baking. And not the sourdough kind. These bricks were heated in the evening's campfire until they radiated heat like a preacher in July, then carefully wrapped in cloth and tucked under bedding to provide long-lasting warmth. They weren't quite hot water bottles, but they did the trick, minus the risk of spontaneous sogginess. Some settlers took things a step further, literally, by inviting their livestock to share the space. Chickens, goats, even a not-so-small pig named Myrtle could be found nestled at the foot of the bedding, emitting both body heat and mild barn-related scents. Say what you will about porcine hygiene, but a pig in a blizzard was better than a snowdrift in your drawers. And then there were the stoves. Oh yes, the stove, wheeled in like a knight in cast-iron armour. For those, wagons spacious or sturdy enough, and families either rich in coin or poor in frostbite, a compact sheet metal stove could be installed. It had a tiny chimney poking right through the canvas top, and though it occasionally threatened to immolate half the bedding, its cheerful metallic clanging and the smell of burning apple peelings made it a much-loved member of the family. Operating these stoves was an art. You had to fire it up early, manage the airflow, feed it scraps of wood or dried buffalo chips. Yes, the other kind of chips. And balance soggy boots nearby to dry, just beyond the point of combustion. Still, not every wagon had a stove, or a myrtle, or an excess of socks. So families turned to movement, calisthenics by candlelight. Parents might encourage the children to do some gentle jumping or gleeful tussling before bedtime. Not just for fun, mind you, but to warm up their bodies before burying them in quilts and muttered prayers. Then there were hot drinks, though definitions varied. A mug of greasy broth, some chicory-laced coffee, or watered-down molasses slid about in tin cups, sipped slowly as stars blinked above. It wasn't cocoa, but it had the same effect in the cold. A warm belly glowed longer than a cold complaint. Let us not forget the humble sock, the crown jewel of frost avoidance. Families often lacked enough for everyone, leading to dramatic sock-robbing disputes in the darkness, fierce negotiations over who had closer toes to hypothermia, and epic tales of the child who once wore both socks and mittens at bedtime. A legend still whispered in wool-clad reverence, and through all this, a simpler warmth prevailed. Laughter under shared blankets, stories told in whispers to keep out the night, a mother stroking a child's hair, or a father muttering jokes in the deep, dark hush, pretending he wasn't shivering just as hard. Outside, the blizzard might howl like a lonesome dog or a politician with opinions, but within those fragile walls, something held strong. Like the dancing embers of a stove or the stubborn heat of a half-baked brick, the wagon never gave up its warmth easily. Not when so much human determination, improvisation, and livestock were on the line. Now that we've gotten cozy inside the wagon, perhaps it's time we opened the flap and peered outside. For beyond the quilted calm lay a whole new challenge, the night watch. As the snow thickened into curtains swaying across the plains, the covered wagon became less a means of travel and more a floating island of humanity and hope. Cold seeped from the edges like an unwanted dinner guest, the sort that doesn't even bring a pie. But inside that canvas cocoon, families did what they could to stay warm with a resourcefulness that bordered somewhere between brilliant and mildly reckless. The campfire, romantic as it sounds, was no use during a blizzard. Not only would it be smothered faster than a toddler's sneeze in a teacup, but setting any fire too near the wagon risked igniting the very thing keeping you dry. And while few things are cozier than being wrapped in wool, very few things are less cozy than flammable disaster. So instead, warmth had to be summoned from the depths of imagination and physics. Mostly physics. Picture this: red-hot stones pulled directly from an earlier fire, wrapped tightly in cloth and tucked under bedding like sleepy dragons. These were the prairie equivalent of hot water bottles, except instead of water, you had lava-y rocks and the faint thrill of possible third-degree burns if you weren't careful. They were slid beneath buffalo robes or homemade quilts, joining the feet of sleepy children who'd already stolen all the warmth in the bed and refused to give it back. Buffalo robes, by the way, were the ultimate in 19th century winter fashion, not just in style, but in sheer surface area and survival value. Made from the thick hides of bison, they were perhaps the only thing on earth that made a blizzard second-guess its own authority. A buffalo robe didn't just warm you, it menaced the cold into leaving. Families also insulated the interiors of their wagons using anything they could stitch, stuff, or strategically drape. Heavy quilts were dangled from the ceiling like fort walls. Flour sacks became makeshift draft blockers. Rugs and sheepskins were thrown onto the wooden wagon bed, which otherwise radiated chill like a haunted floorboard. And if human ingenuity wasn't enough, there was always livestock. Yes, in moments of sheer desperation, when the wind howled loud enough to rearrange your personality, folks sometimes brought chickens and even young calves into the shelter of the wagon. Nothing says rustic charm like cuddling a live chicken for warmth. Chickens, as it turns out, are surprisingly tepid companions, not particularly fluffy, nor willing to be used as a pillow, but undeniably warm and less inclined to judge than your in-laws. In fact, if you happen to be traveling with a milk cow, bonus points if her name was something like Bessie or Clementine. She might spend the night tied right beside your wheels, braving the snow with the kind of stoicism only achieved by animals who suspect they're essential to butter. Her slow, steady chewing and steam-like breath added an oddly calming rhythm to the long, frigid hours. Nature's metronome, keeping beat while everyone inside dreamed of stoves and toasted bread. Some families even went one step further and banked snow along the outside of their wagon's foundation, piling it up carefully, like oddly cooperative frosting. It may sound counterintuitive to pile snow when you're trying not to freeze, but snow, when compacted, can serve as insulation, supposedly, though one suspects it was also done simply because once snow starts falling sideways, you have to put it somewhere. Perhaps the real secret, though, the unspoken one passed through generations without pen or paper, was body heat. That reliable, modest magic. Children and parents slept tangled together beneath layers of everything they owned, arms and legs woven like yarn in a basket. There was no privacy, but there was warmth. The kind that hushes you with a sigh and slows your heartbeat a little. It didn't look glamorous. It looked like a pile of laundry that had learned to breathe. But it worked. And of course, there was always one soul who stayed half awake, cocking an ear for the snowbound creak of wagon wood, or the far-off mournful howl of coyotes measuring dinner options. Someone who kept the fire of vigilance burning, if not literally, then in spirit, because protecting warmth wasn't just a matter of temperature, but of love. And as dawn crept slowly back across that hibernating horizon, with its bruised purples and icy blues, the fire would be rebuilt, the ashes stirred, and the hot stones prepared once more. But before that grand return to movement, in one quiet, breath-fogged moment, someone would curl tighter under their buffalo robe, listening to the muffled symphony of snoring, soft breath, and the bass hum of stubborn survival. And somewhere beside them, perhaps, a chicken cooing in its sleep. Now, as the morning light begins to tease the edges of the canvas, our eyes turn to the simplest object with the grandest ambition, the humble wagon stove. As the first stars winked through the frost-hazed sky, the prairie whispered to itself in a language of dry grasses and distant coyotes. Inside a covered wagon creaking somewhere on the Great Plains, a family bustled in the muffled rituals of keeping warm. Rituals that, while not particularly glamorous, were as vital to survival as breathing, especially when the air turned so cold it seemed to crunch when you inhaled it. Now, you might imagine that pioneers had access to a secret stash of thick goose-down parkas or portable wood-burning hot tubs tucked beneath the wagon bench. Alas, real life on the prairie was a great deal itchier. Wool, dear listener, wool and determination, the kind of sweaters that made you look like a repurposed sheep and felt like they'd been woven on a loom of thorn bushes. But still, they were warm. And warm enough was a triumph. Families would crowd together on freezing nights in a kind of thermal democracy. Everyone got as close to the center of the collective body heat as physical laws allowed. This might mean nestling 6 people into a space best suited for 3, arms awkwardly folded, knees colliding under quilts that may or may not have started their lives as horse blankets. Hygiene took the evening off, and then there was the stove, or rather, the small iron cube dignified with the title. Wagon stoves were fiercely loyal, huffing out heat that would happily scald your eyebrows in exchange for the sacrifice of nearly all your wood supply. Portable stoves, known quaintly as sheet iron stoves, were designed by people who seemed to have declared war on logistical ease. They weighed too much, radiated too little, and required constant feeding. You could not simply light one and sleep. No, someone had to rise at regular intervals like a dutiful pyromaniac to nurse the flame, lest the frost reclaim its dominion inside the wagon. And yet, there was a romance to it, in its own drafty way. A mother stirring cornmeal mush on that tiny stove, while wearing mittens with the fingertips cut off. A father adding wood to the fire and pretending his fingers hadn't gone rigid with cold hours ago. Children wrapped like little burritos in whatever blankets weren't nailed down, whispering stories or humming tunes to chase sleep through the chill. You might be wondering, what of the wagon canvas? Surely it leaks cold air like a sieve in a snowstorm. Quite right. But the ingenuity of the frontier spirit should not be underestimated. Families would hang extra quilts or rugs along the inside of the wagon walls, creating a rough-hewn insulation system. If you hang enough old carpets on something, it may no longer look like a wagon, but it will trap warmth well enough to stop your toes from turning into historical anecdotes. And then there were the hot bricks, simple, noble, and deeply appreciated. Before turning in for the night, someone, usually whoever still had feeling in their hands, would heat bricks on the stove, wrap them in flannel, and place them inside the bedding. These mini heat sources, stuck at the feet or cradled against the belly, could mean the difference between a bad night and a night best described as mildly uncomfortable but survivable. A low bar, perhaps, But on nights where the wind howled like a banshee impersonator with a vendetta, survival was a perfectly noble goal. Sometimes, a smelly but beloved ally would join the nightly convergence. The family cow. Yes, in true frontier fashion, desperate times called for bovine solutions. Bringing livestock into the wagon or attaching a small lean-to shelter meant the warmth of fresh body heat, and as a bonus, a kind of ambient mooing to lull you to sleep. Sure, it smelled like the inside of a boot factory, but it was warm. And above all these little strategies swirled a quiet, stubborn kind of hope. The awareness, even in bone-deep cold, that morning would eventually arrive, that the sun would rise behind the hills, cracking its sleepy yoke across the snow, and that warmth, however temporary, would return. For now, the wind pressed against the canvas with the insistence of a curious ghost, and inside, the slow exhale of a snoring child fogged the air beneath a patched quilt. Somewhere nearby, the embers cracked softly, and a brick nestled near a pair of woolen-wrapped feet gave off one last sleepy sigh of warmth. And as the sky deepened into a dark blue bruise, painted with frosty stars, another sound stirred. Not wind this time, but the faint creak of a wagon wheel. A memory of movement to come. By the time the stars blinked over the prairie like nervous eyelids, the temperature had often slipped well below what any sensible person would classify as acceptable for survival. Yet out there, fenced in by the whimpering wind and a wilderness so large it made thoughts feel small, wagon families still managed, somehow miraculously, stubbornly, to stay warm. Tonight, we peek inside one of those creaking wooden wagons, not through the canvas flaps, which have been double-stitched and tucked tight against the cold, but through imagination, which gets better reception anyway. Once the fire had been banked outside in a smothered mound of coals and ash, and the animals tucked close together for body heat, and a bit of gossip probably, families would gather inside their fabric-covered arks in layers of wool, patchwork, and improvisation. Blankets, you see, were both vital and sentimental. Heirlooms stitched from old coats, flour sacks, and the sleeves of people sorely missed. These homemade quilts had the sort of warmth that came partly from insulation and partly from love, although goose down was always welcome aboard. But layered quilts alone were rarely enough. Wagons weren't known for tight construction. Every board whispered secrets to the wind, and the air inside could develop a kind of damp miserableness that not even the thickest socks could outmuffle. So families got cozy the old-fashioned way. They piled in together like a litter of puppies, a sort of human lasagna, with layers of children, cousins, elders, and, if luck allowed, a dog with a thick winter coat, and no personal space issues. There was also an almost sacred reliance on something called the soapstone trick. Soapstone, it turns out, has a talent for holding heat long after it's been removed from the fire. By day, stones would be nestled amongst hot embers like forgotten potatoes. By evening, they'd be wrapped in scraps of cloth and tucked between blankets or into the beds of children, like warm, silent bedtime stories. Soapstone doesn't scald or leak, like hot water bottles eventually would. It just holds the warmth and minds its own business. And oh, the iron foot warmers, a proud contraption that lived up to its name with endearing literalness. A compact little box, often filled with coals and slipped beneath a child's feet, or stirred under a wagon seat, it offered concentrated, glowing stubbornness against the urgent bite of frost. Of course, one needed to be careful. Any foot warmer left unattended could rather dramatically convert warmth into fire, which wasn't the plan at all. but used wisely, it was a quiet protest against the indifference of winter. Some folks used sleeping caps, despite the fact that they look entirely ridiculous in every surviving painting. The caps served a purpose though, keeping heads warm without exposing them too extravagantly to the fire hazard that came with a lantern-lit interior. And yes, some wagons used lanterns, hung carefully, kept low, dimmed intentionally. But mostly, warmth wasn't about fire. It was about ingenuity. It was about layering thermodynamics with affection. And in the mornings, stepping out of the wagon was the true act of courage. The children would huddle near the dying embers, their breath forming clouds worthy of tiny weather systems. Mothers would coax the fire back to life with the same stubborn energy used to hush thunder, and fathers, swaddled in 5 shirts and a bad mood, would check the animals, the wheels, and whether the wind had relocated their breakfast supplies into another county. Sometimes, if it was really bleak, they'd just wait, delay the departure, huddle in a heap and tell stories. Nothing warms the body like the rhythm of a good yarn, especially when it's about someone else falling into a frozen creek. And then there's the unspoken secret weapon, singing. Tucked into frost-furred blankets, families would hum lullabies or hymns, something soft and almost apologetic, as if singing could embarrass the cold into retreating. It rarely worked, but it did make the wagon feel less like a box of discomfort and more like a place lit with something ancient, something like hope. This is the quiet heroism of staying warm without central heating, or even the courtesy of decent insulation tape. It may not be how you choose to winter, but it may make your own thermostat suddenly seem like a minor deity deserving of its own devotional shrine. And as the prairie wind thickens, painting frost on the wagon's edges like delicate lace, the family inside settles deeper under their piles of stitched patience, warmed by soapstone, songs, and the secret delight of having made it through another night. In the hush, in that brief moment before someone snores, or the dog chases a dream rabbit, the frontier whispers another quiet lesson. Whispers will continue to, over here, just a little further down the trail, where the fire is waiting to be lit once again. A steady snowfall blanketed the prairie, transforming the wagon trail into a quiet theater of white. The flakes drifted silently, like moths searching for candlelight, though the only glow this far from civilization flickered feebly from behind canvas and stitched seams. Inside a Conestoga or prairie schooner, depending on whether you preferred wagon names with a beer barrel twang or a seafaring flair, families waited out the cold with the calm of people who had absolutely no choice in the matter. Now, if you're imagining that every pioneer wagon came equipped with a compact fireplace, flannel bedding, and a steaming pot of stew never going cold, I regret to inform you that you may be thinking of a log cabin themed bed and breakfast in Vermont. The reality was slightly more rustic. For warmth, families relied not on radiators or even glowing cabins, but on each other, quite literally. Pioneers understood the ancient and time-honored tradition of becoming one large human-shaped heating appliance. Children were tucked like kindling between adults, wrapped tightly in every available layer, from threadbare quilts to buffalo hides to old military coats, repurposed into family heirlooms, and occasionally as emergency soup strainers, but that's another chapter. The wagons themselves were shaped like loaves of bread turned on their sides and about as insulated. The canvas cover, while determined in spirit, was less than enthusiastic about holding back the winter wind. Some families would line the inner walls with whatever they had: oiled cloth, hide scraps, Or, in moments of extreme creativity, flattened flour sacks stitched together and blessed with the fervent hope that flour remembered anything about being warm. For warmth beneath the body, a crucial battlefield where freezing nights waged their coldest wars, pioneers turned to straw, buffalo robes, or even folded spare clothing. A common trick was to sleep on top of hot rocks, carefully heated near the evening fire, then wrapped in cloth and placed at the wagon's base. This, of course, was a delicate science. Too hot, and you toasted your toes. Too cold, and you wondered what the point of sentience was at all. And sometimes, in the more social corners of the prairie, travelers camped near each other, wagons drawn into circle formation, not just for gunslinging dramatics or chow time convenience, but because the shared warmth of neighboring fires and bodies created a humble microclimate of get-through-it togetherness. It was like an Airbnb, if all the Airbnbs were homemade and nobody had heard of air or beds or breakfast. But pioneers were nothing if not resourceful. Some even brought along warming pans, flat metal trays filled with coals, and slid beneath the layers of bedrolls like a rudimentary electric blanket powered by sheer optimism and fire. Less cozy if you happen to turn in your sleep and wake up with your blanket smoldering. One gentleman reportedly toasted his left boot clean off during an overly enthusiastic heating attempt. The boot, thus liberated from this world, became a great story among travelers, while the man hobbled about in a scandalous display of uneven footwear. Children, meanwhile, were often given the job of body burritos, rolled into thick quilts like sleeping cinnamon rolls and buried between parents or older siblings. It wasn't just cute, although it was undeniably cute. Body heat was the most consistent source of nighttime warmth available, aside from sheer defiance. And speaking of defiance, there's the matter of those who actually slept outside the wagon by choice, or lack of wagon space. Some teamsters or hired hands slept near the oxen or under the wagons themselves, flopped in furs like reluctant wilderness burritos. Here, the line between bravery and poor planning was often negotiable. But in a strange twist of evolutionary humility, many animals, dogs, and occasionally goats, were deemed essential co-sleepers. One journal entry speaks of a calf that snuck into the wagon during a blizzard night and was afterward forgiven all manners of indoor accidents on account of having saved 3 toes from frostbite. It's important to understand, no matter how romantic the notion of pioneering has grown over time, this warmth was never guaranteed. It was wrestled from the prairie one night at a time, with cleverness, courage, and the sort of hands-on problem-solving that often involved exactly one pair of gloves too few. Outside the canvas walls, the wind continued its winter sermon, but inside, beneath that patchwork of hides, cloth, and closely packed snores and dreams, lay the true hearth of the prairie, the human stubbornness to stay warm, stay alive, and maybe, just maybe, laugh about it come spring. Somewhere beneath that hand-sewn quilt, a snoring grandfather rolled over, muttered something about soup beans, and accidentally elbowed a sleeping terrier. And as the snow deepened, so too did the silence, broken only by a crackle of wind, and the faint memory of a warming pan that thankfully didn't catch fire tonight. Let us wander onward. For while warmth may be patched together from ragged edges and shared breath, the next mystery on our path is stitched from hearth tales and strange inventions. Somewhere beneath a grey sky, heavy with winter breath, a cluster of wagon families huddled on the wind-bruised prairie, their canvas-covered homes groaning softly in protest. If you've ever tried sleeping in a glorified wooden box during a snow squall, you'll know that warmth isn't so much a luxury as it is a form of stubborn optimism. And yet, with no Wi-Fi, no weightless down duvets, and no heated mattress pads named after obscure Greek gods, these 19th century trailblazers still managed to keep from freezing solid. The secret? Well, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked better than you'd think. Ingenuity, body heat, and a surprising number of baked potatoes. Truly, the humble potato did more than fill bellies. Wives and children would wrap freshly boiled or oven-roasted potatoes in cloth and nestle them into bedrolls before anyone climbed in. These starchy stand-ins for hot water bottles retained heat for hours, enough to make a wool blanket feel luxurious. And in the morning, breakfast in bed, quite literally, you'd wake up warmish, stare down at your slightly frost-dusted toes, and then eat your heat source. Delicious and practical. Mother Nature could never. For warmth of the metaphysical sort, many families relied on what we must charitably call long, pointless stories. Grandfathers, grandmothers, or anyone with a decent memory and tolerance for repetition would spin tales by lantern light. Not because children needed entertainment, though they did, but because talking kept your jaw moving, which generated just enough heat to prevent it from freezing shut. Also, laughter was an excellent distraction from the wind trying to claw its way through every seam of the wagon. Now, the wagons themselves weren't exactly Fort Knox. They were drafty, wooden, buggy-sized boxes designed mainly to transport sacks of flour and dreams. But with some sewing magic and a bit of frontier stubbornness, wagons were transformed into snug, if smoky, sleep chambers. Families would hang heavy woolen quilts or hand-stitched linings along the insides. Some even used buffalo hides if they had them, layers upon layers insulating against icy air that seeped in like curious raccoons. One particularly innovative family from Vermont lined the interior of their wagon with canvas soaked in linseed oil to block wind drafts. Was it inflammable? Extremely. But cozy? Surprisingly. It was the 1800s version of safeish. While candles were used sparingly, nobody wanted to knock over a flame and set the entire family ablaze. There were other, more primitive heating contraptions. Heated rocks, for instance. Pioneers would place large, fire-warmed stones wrapped in rags at the wagon's center. They smelled faintly of damp armpit and ash, but by all accounts, they worked. Children, small as they were, often slept like burritos packed in straw. Hay was stuffed beneath bedrolls and between sleeping bodies to create a natural insulation. It, how shall we put this, shared an aroma with livestock, but it was remarkably effective. And when positioned just right, a bed of hay could double as a mattress soft enough to make you forget momentarily that a possum had likely walked over it earlier that day. But perhaps nothing saved frontier families from cold like the irresistible coziness of close quarters snuggling. Whole families would sleep smushed together like a pile of laundry left too long in the basket. Eldest to youngest, arranged like spoons in a drawer, sharing breath and blankets, and the occasional elbow to the rib cage. It wasn't always comfortable, but not freezing to death has a way of making you more tolerant of Aunt Martha's feet. There were even rare winters when families crafted makeshift tents inside the wagon, draping fabric to create a whisper-quiet insulation bubble. Children called them wagon caves and saw them as entire magical worlds, much warmer worlds, where bedtime came with cookies and stories and the knowledge that, outside your curtain, the snow might be falling, but in here, everything was soft and glowing and real. And when all else failed, when warmth wouldn't hold and the winds grew too bold, families turned to the one true winter tradition: denial. They sang songs. They played word games. One bizarre favourite, according to an 1857 journal, involved guessing the number of icicles that would form on the oxen's yoke by morning. History never said who won. As night deepened and prairie darkness wrapped itself around the wagons like a wool shawl, families drifted into sleep accompanied by the crackle of cooling rocks, the smooth hush of snowflakes landing on tight canvas, and the strange comfort of 10 cold noses beneath 6 shared blankets. Tomorrow would be another day of frost-nipped fingers and warming strategies we can only describe as creative bordering on borderline. But for now, the families slept easy-ish, knowing that what they lacked in thermostats, they made up for in potatoes and persistence. And just beyond the horizon, somewhere in the slow breath of dawn's approach, another warmth-bringing secret of the trail waited to unfold. If you were a child snuggled inside a canvas-covered wagon, somewhere on the frosty plains of 1840s Nebraska territory, chances are your bedtime routine had very little in common with a modern wind-down playlist, and rather more in common with a desperate hunt for elbow room and shared body heat. The night crept in early on the prairie, quick and quiet like a cat with cold paws. Shadows stretched long over the endless snow muffin landscape, and the family, now huddled near their wagon, was already mid-negotiation. Who got the outer edge of the bedroll, and who got the high honour of big toe warming duties? You see, warmth wasn't a luxury. It was a collaborative project. A typical wagon might be packed tighter than a holiday fruitcake, only instead of candied cherries, you had sacks of flour, cast iron pots, and the occasional snoring grandfather wedged between barrels of pickled cabbage that no one admitted to packing. The families had to get creative to make a bed out of what was essentially a wooden box on wheels, exposed to all the ambitious ambitions of a Midwestern blizzard. Fires seemed like the obvious solution. Build a roaring one and bask in its flickery hug. But there's a small issue. Covered wagons were, how shall we put this politely, extravagantly flammable. Starting a fire near or inside one was a bit like lighting a candle in a hay-filled closet. Sure, it's warm for a second, but then you're explaining your life choices while watching your belongings become wind-blown cinders. Instead, pioneers relied on methods that today would pass for rustic Instagram trends, but back then were just common sense and a touch of prairie desperation. Buffalo hides were a favorite. Thick, insulating, and just heavy enough to flatten small children if you weren't careful. Pioneers would layer them over beds made of straw-filled ticks being long sacks of rough fabric stuffed with hay. Dreamy, right? It was like sleeping inside livestock bedding, only cold and slightly haunted. Clothing, too, served dual purposes. That flannel petticoat worn all day under the ever-watchful eyes of modesty. By night, it became a scarf, a hat, or if the situation grew dire, a shared blanket called the lump, where multiple siblings were fused by the sheer weight of woolen love. People learned early that sleep was not an individual sport. Sharing heat wasn't just cozy, it was survival. 2 to 4 people to a bed was common, and those beds weren't always beds. Sometimes it was the wagon floor. Sometimes it was under the wagon, shielded from the wind with canvas and prayer. When snows came, snow would be pushed up against the canvas skirt, effectively turning the wagon into a mild kind of snow cave, which, while still freezing, was apparently less freezing than the alternative. No cave at all. Water bottles weren't yet the plush hot pouches we know today, but pioneering mothers had something similar in mind. Heated stones from the fire were wrapped in cloth or tucked into iron kettles. then nestled into the bedding like sleepy dragons. These radiated heat for a few magical, snuggly hours until the cold crept back in, clever and smug as ever. Socks were a family-wide obsession. If wool socks were available, and that was a big if, they were practically treasure. A single pair might be rotated through a household faster than you could say chilblains. Some siblings made deals, chores for first sock dibs. Others just waited until someone fell asleep, then executed a quiet, cozy sock heist. And let us not forget the ultimate pioneer innovation, sleeping with your animals. Not in the house, mind you. But if the night was especially severe, a child might find herself in the straw with the goats, or Pa might bundle himself alongside a mule that ran surprisingly warm and rarely kicked. Livestock, it turns out, were not only essential to transporting you across America, they also made decent space heaters in a bind. Despite the cold, misery wasn't the prevailing bedtime emotion. Wrapped in hides, huddled together like a pile of onions in a basket, families whispered stories by lantern light. They listened to the wind scratch across the plains like a blind fiddler, laughed about the day's minor disasters, spilled beans, broken eggs, the ox that had stage 3 attitude, and fell asleep somehow, in laughter and heat they'd built together with nothing but elbow grease, buffalo fur, and mulish determination. And when the first pale hints of dawn brushed across the canvas above, the frost thick as a lace curtain, someone would wriggle from the pile, brace for the chill, and start the fire again, not just for warmth, but for breakfast. And what a breakfast it would be. But that's a tale best told slowly as the smoke begins to rise. All through the high prairie evening, the snow fell like a patient secret, tiny whispers of white stacking into something perilous and poetic. Inside a Conestoga wagon pitched in the lee of a windbreak of skeletal cottonwoods, a family huddled together, swaddled in every available textile from gingham to desperation. By now, everyone had stopped pretending the thick canvas cover was in any way thick. It was functionally a ceiling made of enthusiastic gauze, promising to flutter, but not to insulate. So the key to warmth lay somewhere else, somewhere between clever layering and the calm, resigned psychology of colonial optimism. First, there were the feather ticks, not to be confused with a particularly aggressive avian parasite. A feather tick was essentially an early sleeping bag's flamboyant cousin. Gloriously overstuffed fabric duvets filled with goose down, homemade and often passed down between generations like a prized casserole recipe. Wagon families would strip these bulbous quilts off their morning bedding and pile them strategically over laps, shoulders, and any particularly cold feet, which was statistically all feet at all times. These sleeping arrangements weren't just for comfort. They were survival puzzles crafted in domestic geometry. The trick, whispered from covered wagon to sod house, was to sleep all in a huddle. Warmth, it turns out, is a communal activity. Parents in the center, children wrapped on either side like crescent, moons. Sometimes an extra cousin was added for warmth. Less favored ones could be rotated to the edge. Evenings began with a reluctant undressing-redressing ritual. Wet socks were swapped for marginally less wet socks. 2 pairs of long johns were celebrated. 3, positively luxurious. And if anyone had managed to acquire wool, a smuggled scrap, or a precious petticoat, it was appointed a heroic assignment as a scarf or mitten lining. But let us not forget the warming pan, that unsung artifact of frontier domesticity. A shallow metal pan filled with embers, or, in tougher times, a few regretfully burned stove chips. It was slid beneath the bedclothes to create momentary sacs of warmth, like little sunrises under the covers. Of course, these came with both risk and reward. A bed warmed too effectively might catch a bit too much fire, which is its own kind of drama, especially during a snowstorm. Still, families weighed their odds carefully. After all, warmth is a powerful temptress. Yet perhaps nothing brought more dependable heat than livestock proximity. In true frontier fashion, prairie logic dictated that if you couldn't bring the stove to the barn, you brought the barn to the stove. Oxen, sheep, and anything that baaed, mooed, or could emit a medium temperature were occasionally invited into tented areas near the wagon. This, naturally, came with an air quality trade-off, but nothing says bonding like a sleepover with the family cows. Nothing breaks down olfactory pride faster than -20 wind chill. Then there were the heated stones. These humble heroes were tucked into the glowing embers of the fire at dusk. Flat, heavy river rocks given just enough time to become volcanic, but not yet rebellious. When wrapped in flannel or placed in sturdy metal boxes, they became radiant bedtime foot warmers. Yes, they occasionally burned holes through socks or startled toes into sprints, but the overall satisfaction rate remained high. Children, however, had their own system. They invented games like Who's Got the Warmest Armpit and Let's Pretend We're Toasted Muffins. There was even an ill-fated round of Breathe on Me Till I'm Warm, which was quickly retired due to excessive giggling and parental threats to disown them all if giggles continued past bedtime. Outside, the snow deepened into a muffled hush, pressing silence onto the plains like a hand-cooled forehead. Inside, warmth was less about fire and more about faith, the kind of nightly hope that together, tucked under patchwork covers and barnyard ambience, people could make it to dawn without their cheeks freezing into an emotional expression that read mild alarm. And so, the wagon dimmed into night. The final lantern was extinguished. Breath became fog against the canvas. Somewhere nearby, a goat snored dramatically, and in the quiet, under the tender weight of hand-sewn quilts, feet toasty by stone or miracle, the frontier family dreamed of spring mornings, of warm hearth to come. Drifting now, gently, we press onward, into a winter morning that would arrive without asking, and the mysterious stove that almost, but not quite, exploded. There's a peculiar sort of silence that settles on the prairie after a snowstorm. Not the aggressive, attention-seeking silence of someone hoping you'll ask what's wrong, but a soft, muffled quiet, the kind that wraps around you like a feather quilt and tells you everything is precisely as asleep as it should be. That hush was both friend and foe to the families huddled in their creaking covered wagons during long frozen nights. It meant the blizzard had passed, but also that the bitter cold had permission to really sink its teeth in. And so, once the storm's tantrum was finished, the real performance of prairie survival began. You might think heating a wagon was about warming the space. No, that would have been too easy. It was more of a slow motion attempt to not die of frostbite while keeping various limbs, livestock, and loved ones from turning into sleepy ice sculptures. Life inside the wagon was a kind of nightly nesting ritual. First came the bedding, a pile of buffalo robes, patchwork quilts, and anything else that vaguely resembled heat. Children were often shaped into a sort of human lasagna, the younger ones squashed between older siblings like thermal filling. The parents, generous or perhaps just accepting of fate, took outside layers. The truly cold nights called for something more inventive. Enter the humble hot brick. Before sunset, a brick, or if you didn't have one, a rock that looked like it had potential, was warmed in the embers of the fire. This heated treasure was then wrapped in flannel or tucked between rolled socks and placed beneath the blanket pile, radiating a gentle, slow-cooked warmth. The science was questionable, but the placebo effect was strong. And frankly, if a heated rock whispered bedtime lullabies to your toes, who were you to disagree? Another favorite of prairie thermal engineering was the foot warmer box. A small wooden container filled with glowing coals, it was carefully set inside the wagon beneath the metal grate. Unattended, it could warm the space. Unwatched, it could also burn the entire wagon to the ground. Every settler at some point had one wary eye open, wondering if they were being gently roasted along with the stew. Still, the box became a prized tool among the more daring families, those who believed in balancing fire safety and feeling in their extremities. Ladies in long wool skirts would hunch over the box during dinner, sighing as the heat rose up through the soles of their formidable boots. If you've ever tried to cook, sew, and parent 3 children during a November windstorm, a warm foot is more than comfort. It's a small, glowing miracle. But warmth could also be cultivated through companionship. The woolly thrum of a sleepy cow just outside the canvas flap provided more than background ambience. Livestock huddled close to the wagon added both windbreak and low-level thermal benefits. Prairie livestock, cows, oxen, the occasional gloomy goat, were the original electric blankets. Furry, flatulent, and wholly unaware of their contribution to human comfort, they were quietly essential. One less frequently discussed member of this unholy alliance was the family dog. You won't find this in many history books, but dogs were sleeping bag specialists. Tucked beneath the quilts or melted into the wagon floorboards, dogs weren't just grooming partners and burglar alarms. On nights where the mercury wandered south forever, a good dog could mean the difference between waking up refreshed and waking up with toes that rattled like china teacups. Of course, the many feet of snow could make supply gathering nearly impossible. That's when the ingenuity of frontier families truly shone. Mittens stitched from old, flour sacks, wool patched with canvas, and meals cooked by candlelight from whatever hadn't frozen entirely. One recorded journal entry described a stew made from dried apples, a pinch of lard, and salt meant for curing hides. The taste, according to the writer, was questionable, but warm, which, on those nights, was apparently enough. Warmth, you see, wasn't always about temperature. Sometimes it was the sound of your father's snoring, sturdy and impossibly loud, reminding you the storm hadn't carried him off after all. Sometimes it was the creak of the wagon bow above your head, the familiar scent of wool, smoke, and someone's feet, all muddled into a kind of family perfume, a reminder that you were still here, still together, still surviving. And sometimes it was the unexpected comfort of community, a neighboring wagon offering a second pot of tea they didn't need, or the muffled laughter from the children in the next camp, giggling over snowmen in the dark. But even on the harshest nights, there was always a flicker of flame, small, careful, and stubborn, just like the people keeping it alive. And as that flame dimmed into coals, and the wind on the canvas softened into less of a growl and more a sigh, the quiet once again took over. Tomorrow would come, with frost on your eyelashes and chores that would make your knees cry. But tonight the bricks were warm, the dog was nearby, and sleep was settling like snow over the prairie. And somewhere just beyond the flicker of the last ember, another tale was brewing. one that included bears, bacon, and a very questionable sleeping arrangement. A thin frost curled like lace across the wagon canvas, swirling quietly as the wind passed over the prairie. It was the kind of cold that crept in slowly, as if politely checking if anyone would mind before icing the nostrils and nibbling at extremities. The great blizzards of the American frontier weren't so much storms as they were uninvited house guests with a flair for drama and zero interest in leaving. But the emigrants, they were stubborn things. People who had decided that the Mississippi River wasn't nearly far enough west, and who believed, perhaps too optimistically, that owning land no one had lived on before sounded like a good idea. And when winter wrapped its chill fingers around their wagons, those wagon families had to improvise. Now, let's talk buffalo chips. Dry, lightweight, relatively smokeless. And yes, we're talking about buffalo leftovers. You see, actual wood on the open prairie was scarcer than polite conversation at a gold rush poker table. So children were routinely sent out to gather these nature-made fuel nuggets. Pioneer kids might not have known what a piano sounded like, but they could spot a well-dried dung chip at 20 yards. With mittens on, ideally. Though rumor has it, there were many unfortunate bare-handed scoops by distracted children and unlucky newcomers. Buffalo chips were hauled back in baskets, tossed into the makeshift stove or open fire, and, believe it or not, they worked remarkably well to warm up the wagon's innards. The smell, well, let's say it had a certain earthy bouquet that took some getting used to. But when your toes have gone fully wooden and your dog's shivering in his sleep, dignity yields quickly to warmth. Then there was the bedding arrangement. A family of 6 would sleep like a row of sardines, layering every quilt, shawl, cloak, and horse blanket over themselves. Whenever a stray sock turned up, it was treated like buried treasure. The goal was body heat. If you could trap it, share it, or harvest it from someone else, it became winter gold. Babies were often swaddled so tightly they resembled overstuffed bundt cakes, their little noses the only thing peeking out, a reminder that, yes, there was still a person in there somewhere. Many wagons installed a tiny, perilous contraption called a sheet iron stove, which sounds quaint until you realize it was essentially a burning box rolling through snowdrifts inside a flammable wooden wagon. Half the work was in keeping the fire lit. The other half was in praying the whole place didn't go up when someone bumped the kettle. But it gave just enough heat to stop sleep from becoming a glacier-bound hallucination. And so, people accepted the risk with a shrug. Or rather, with several shrugs layered in wool. To fend off the icy knives of wind that slashed through canvas cracks, families stitched quilts into the seams. If cloth was short, they used newspapers, flour sacks, or whatever else wasn't needed to clothe the person. By night, the wagon became a patchwork igloo of ingenuity. And lest you think this was all Spartan misery, there was still laughter. Usually at the expense of a father who insisted he wasn't cold, before quietly stealing 3 layers from the dog. Even the food was customized for warmth. Dinners became steaming ironclads of beans, salt pork, and hard biscuits softened in broth, or snowmelt, depending on availability. These heated dishes weren't just meals, they were hand warmers, winter therapy, and the occasional weapon in argument resolution. Hot beans are remarkably persuasive. Perhaps the coziest invention of all was the warming stone. You'd place a fist-sized rock near the fire until it grew golden hot, then wrap it carefully in cloth and tuck it into your bedding. If you were a child, this was a nightly delight. If you were the unfortunate one tasked with fetching the rock from the fire, it was more of a perilous mission handed down from frustrated older siblings. And yet, despite the chill, the smell of burning dung, the creaky stove, and the chorus of wind-howling lullabies, people kept going. They huddled through the night, hearts tucked closely around shared stories, dog breath, and the faint promise of spring. Winter would eventually pass, but in the meantime, warmth wasn't measured in degrees. It was measured in the softness of hands passed beneath the covers, the shared smiles over borrowed socks, and the quiet pride of having survived another night on the edge of nowhere. And when morning came, as a pale sun peeked through frost-laced canvas, the world outside might still be frozen, but inside, even if just barely, a little warmth remained. Now, as the prairie wind turns once more and the wagon wood softly groans in reply, we'll drift toward another night's tale, one with fewer buffalo chips perhaps, and a bit more moonlight. As the last rays of an anemic prairie sun sank shyly beneath the ragged edge of the horizon, pioneer families tucked into their wagons like biscuits into a Dutch oven. Outside, the wind began to stir with purposeful menace, a dry rehearsal for snowbound theatrics to come. And within the canvas-swathed sanctuary of their wooden homes on wheels, our weary travelers prepared for another night of frontier survival, a phrase which sounded noble, but often boiled down to, "Don't freeze your toes off before breakfast." Now, if you're picturing advanced heating systems or crackling log fires serenely burning inside these wagons, gently warming smiling families in bonnets and suspenders, I admire your optimism. But the truth was far more flannel and far less fireplace. Heating a wagon on the trail wasn't just impractical. It bordered on the explosive. Fire inside a wooden, canvas-covered vehicle. That's not central heating. That's an accidental barbecue. So families had to get creative. And by creative, I mostly mean cuddly. The first line of defense? Layers upon layers of whatever fabric could be spared. Wool shawls, patched quilts, buffalo hides, and in desperate cases, curtains sacrificed from slightly more fashionable days. Layered like geological strata, these makeshift blankets created an insulating fort. Children and adults alike would sleep skin, to wool, to cotton, to flannel, often so entangled that the morning made untangling a strategic operation. Then there were the legendary bed warmers. Not electric ones, mind you, unless you count friction as electricity. These were often metal pans filled with coals, slid under the bed before sleeping. It warmed the bedding just enough to fool your body into thinking you weren't on the edge of frostbite. Of course, pioneer children, being curious and undersupervised, were known to poke such devices with sticks, resulting in stern lectures from mothers whose patience had frozen somewhere back in Nebraska. And if you were lucky enough to have a dog, not only did you have companionship and perhaps an early warning system for stampeding livestock, you also had a portable heat generator. Dogs were, in fact, pioneer-approved space heaters, furry, loyal, and known to snore with integrity. Yet perhaps the oddest, but most unintentionally charming heating method used on bitter prairie nights were the bed bricks. Before turning in, a brick or heavy stone would be heated in the wagon's cooking fire, which was set up outside earlier in the evening. Once warmed, and I do mean let cool for exactly the right number of minutes unless you fancy branding your sheets, these were wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. The result? Toasty toes until approximately 2 a.m., at which point you woke up to what felt like cuddling a warm boulder. Some settlers, particularly in caravans making the journey across plains in staggered groups, would dig shallow fire pits near the wagons and pile them with hot coals, covering them with dirt to radiate warmth through the night. ingenious, slightly risky, and about as subtle as an underground dragon napping beneath your wheel axle. And where warmth failed, calories helped. Families would eat hearty meals before sleep, not purely for enjoyment, though who would say no to a late-night elk stew, but because calories meant heat. Digesting food burns energy, and energy creates warmth. So in a very real sense, eating one more biscuit was a form of survival. Science said so. Mothers said so even louder. Still, nothing beat the communal approach. Whole families slept together beneath their quilts and hides, more for necessity than niceness, though it did have the side effect of sewing camaraderie tighter than any needle through wool. A toddler kicking you in the ribs was somehow more bearable when it kept the chill out of your kidneys. And if all else failed, you didn't sleep. You sat up tending the little lantern, feeding it whale oil or bear grease, and watched the flap of canvas tremble against the wind. Maybe you whispered stories or hummed an old-world lullaby soft enough to shoo away frost. For on those bitter nights, nestled between hardship and hope, even the faintest flicker of warmth felt like a miracle. The sun would rise eventually, though it kept the pioneers waiting in suspenseful silence. And as the dim stars flickered overhead, the next day's ideas were already stirring. New ways to trap heat, to catch fireflies of comfort amid the cold, and one modest invention that turned porcupines, believe it or not, into unlikely allies. Long nights on the prairie had a way of slowing time, like molasses in a frostbite coma. And for settlers in wagon trains edging westward, sleep wasn't a luxury afforded. It was a nightly act of survival. As the sun slipped behind jagged mountain silhouettes and the temperature dropped like a startled weasel, families huddled together in drafty wagons, whispering prayers and blowing on frostbitten fingers, each breath puffing out like tiny ghosts of hope. Inside the canvas-covered wagons, heat was not so much elusive as it was imaginary. The canvas, bless its humble ambition, resisted weather the way a napkin resists a hurricane. And as cold swept under the wheels and clawed through every seam, the pioneers enacted a time-honored play of make-do warmth, bodies, blankets, and bizarre ingenuity. Picture this: a family wedged together like books on a shelf, wrapped in threadbare quilts stitched by grandmothers with names like Hester or Thankful. Flannel-wrapped arms became shared pillows, and younger siblings functioned as perfectly wiggly foot warmers. If you were the family cat, and yes, some wagons had one curled in a basket, you were the most valuable heating asset under the canvas roof. By now you might be wondering, why not just start a fire? Excellent question, dreamy traveller. But campfires under canvas are only romantic in paintings. In reality, an open flame in a wooden wagon was a shortcut to prairie flambe. And those little iron stoves, affectionately dubbed sheet iron jokes, were more likely to set your wagon ablaze than to warm your beans. So the pioneers turned to safer methods, including the exceedingly glamorous heated rocks. Stones were heated during the evening meal, then carefully rolled into bundles of cloth and tucked into sleeping pallets. These DIY radiators gave about an hour of tepid comfort before returning to their natural state of disappointing neutrality. And for the brave, and perhaps a touch reckless, there were ember boxes. Placing hot embers into cast iron pans and sliding them beneath the makeshift beds was akin to snuggling a lava cupcake. Effective, yes. Flammable, also yes. Pioneers had a complicated relationship with fire. Loving but cautious, like that friend who always remembers your birthday but crashes your wagon into a ditch. Now, let us not underestimate the true frontier furnace. livestock proximity. Oxen were not only labourers. In desperate cold, they were thermal landmarks. Sometimes families would sleep near the animals, side by steaming side. It's not glamorous, sure. But then, neither is frostbite. And nothing says sweet dreams quite like the rhythmic snort of a bovine companion under a star-pricked sky. Clothing, too, played a crucial role. Layers were less about fashion, Paris, and more about physics. Flannel drawers, woolen vests, patched overcoats, even worn-out socks became mittens in moments of desperation. Children were often layered until they resembled very sombre dumplings, waddling solemnly from wagon to bush and back again. And then there were bed warmers, those charming pan-shaped devices with long handles, filled with coals and slid between layers of feather and linen. They were the aristocratic cousins of the humble hot rock. Of course, few families on the trail had such luxuries. For most, the bed warmer was Aunt Millie, known for body heat and an unusual fondness for beef jerky. Food helped too. Hot bean stews, breads uplifted by campfire flames, and cups of something warm. Coffee, weak tea, or prairie punch, which sometimes included whatever liquid was nearest to boiling. A full belly acted as an internal oven, and if the food didn't warm your body, its smell at least raised morale, unless it was salted pork again. Poor salted pork, the hero nobody asked for. Still, despite all the hardship and creative warming strategies, the cold stitched its memory precisely because it was survived. Blankets and embers might take the sting off a blizzard night, but it was love and stubbornness that kept the frost out of their hearts. And somewhere outside the jostling warmth of wagon life, a prairie wind carried the soft, wordless songs of winter, the hush of snow settling, the rustle of canvas, and the almost audible exhale of pioneers who had made it through another night. Just what they'd need before the morning sun rose too early and the firewood ran too low again. But before that burden returned, there was one more cozy secret to uncover beneath the stars and canvas. Among the many unlikely heroes of the American frontier, one deserves a quiet but dignified nod of recognition. The humble buffalo chip, yes, truly, dried bison dung. Tonight we light our story by the gentle glow of prairie irony. Now, before you wrinkle your nose too strongly, remember that desperation and innovation often go hand in mittened hand. When the snow came down in curtains and the wind turned small talk into icicles on the lips, frontier families weren't pulling out stacks of seasoned hardwood or dialing up a thermostat. They were stepping into the Great Plains equivalent of a treasure hunt for poo. Buffalo chips were prized fuel, lightweight, abundant on the rolling plains, and surprisingly slow burning. Children were sometimes affectionately dubbed chip gatherers and were sent out after meals to collect the brown gold that the great shaggy beast left behind. Hot tip, the older the chip, the better it burned. And rest assured, when dried under that wide open sky, they lost most of their aromatic charisma. In a winter storm, when the wind clawed at canvas wagon covers with icy fingernails, a pile of buffalo chips and a flickering flame could mean the difference between frigid misery and an almost cozy existence. Families would huddle beneath layers of quilts and buffalo hides, eyes adjusting to the dim amber flickers of chip fires smouldering in iron stoves. Imagine it, a circle of wagon tongues staked to the ground in defensive posture, mothers and fathers tucked in with all the children under a single wagon canopy, the rhythmic sound of sleet drumming above. A little stove stood watch in the center, fed with care. One scrawny little ember keeping hypothermia politely at bay. Now, for reasons that may seem obvious, chip fires didn't come with pine-scented ambience or the cheerful crackle of oak flames. But they had their charm. They gave off a slow, steady heat, a kind of meditative warmth, as if the prairie was saying, "You may not have oak, dear traveller, but you have perseverance and poop." For richer households, those who had managed, say, to bring along an oxen-drawn stove and a small stack of real wood, heating came with loftier aromas. Cedar and applewood, perhaps, but most homes on wheels had to make do with whatever the land begrudgingly offered. In blizzards, particularly when the chips were damp, survival sometimes required creative combinations. Animal fat-soaked cloth strips, dried weeds, corn husks mixed in, all lovingly mashed together and pressed into a burnable bouquet of frontier resilience. Those who braved the storm nights developed techniques over time, little rituals like warming stones by the fire and then wrapping them in rags to place under hay-stuffed bedding, or heating water in an iron kettle, not to drink, but to pour into a leather pouch, the wild ancestor of the hot water bottle. Innovation, once again, hopping into bed wearing wool socks. Of course, all this required someone to stay awake and tend the fire. This sacred and shiver-prone duty usually rotated among adults. Sitting up with the stove all night might sound grim, but in truth, it had its own kind of hush-filled magic. Those quiet hours, punctuated by wind gusts and the groan of canvas, offered the perfect environment for whispered thoughts, candlelight sketches, or even whittling spoons that didn't particularly need refining. The fire tender would listen intently to the sleeping rise and fall of breath around them, occasionally casting a careful log, or more often, chip, into the hungry stove. The goal was always balance. Too much fuel and smoke filled the wagon, not enough, and waking to frozen toes was a given. And as for the smell, well, let's just say that after a few hours stuck under a canvas wagon top with 6 family members and 5 wool blankets, buffalo chip smoke wasn't the worst thing in the air. Soothing in its own earthy way, the heat of the prairie itself issued from the stove, as if the land remembered how to be kind, even in the middle of December. It may not have been elegant, but it worked. And in those longest nights, when storm bellies pressed low against the plains, a humble chip's gentle glow outshone the finest fireplace in Boston. And speaking of fireplaces, not all heat came from stoves. Some families discovered an unexpectedly effective trick that combined baking with bedtime comfort. But that's a story warming up in the next flickering moment. Somewhere on the frostbitten plains of the American frontier, as another blizzard laid itself lovingly across the canvas of the prairie, like a well-meaning, if slightly aggressive, grandmother, tucking in a restless child, the Wagon families prepared for a ritual older than bedtime itself, not perishing of cold. By today's standards, their gear would be considered somewhere between quaint and criminally underwhelming. There were no heated blankets, no emergency thermal foil wraps, and certainly no apps quietly suggesting to survive this storm, please turn on your Apple Watch. These were people who walked westward into snowstorms wearing wool, determination, and outfits that looked more like eccentric picnic blankets with buttons. But among their inventory of survival oddities, iron stoves, buffalo robes, and sharply worded Presbyterian prayers, one item had quietly become indispensable: the humble soapstone. Now, the soapstone didn't look like much. It resembled a particularly boring chunk of sidewalk, or something you might accidentally kick aside while trying to find your keys in 1812. But this sleepy grey rock had a superpower. It retained heat like a gossip holds secrets. That is to say, very stubbornly. Wagon families would place blocks of it near the fire in the early evening. Once it was cooking hot, and I do mean literal sizzling pocket contents levels of hot, they'd wrap the stones in cloth and tuck them into the bedding. And there, nestled among quilts and dreaming children, the stones would slowly emit warmth all through the night. Modern humans might call this a primitive heating pad, but to the weary pioneers, it was sorcery they could carry. Soapstone wasn't just cozy, it was versatile. Too cold for bare fingers, sit on it. Wet boots threatened frostbite, dry them near it. Need a makeshift babysitter. Put the toddler near the rock and watch them doze off like a sunbathing kitten. The only thing soapstone couldn't do was protect against stepping barefoot onto it in the dark, which might result in a number of old-timey exclamations like "Land o' Goshen" or "Consarnit," the prairie equivalent of modern profanity. But warmth was more than stones. Oh no, they had layers, actual layers. Pioneer bedding was a complicated affair, like sleeping in a burrito engineered to withstand a polar expedition. You started with a mattress stuffed with straw, hay, or whatever was least pokey and most abundant. Then came quilts. One was never enough. These quilts had names grander than ships, or biblical epics, sunshine and shadows, the tree of life, Wig's defeat, names passed down like whispered bedtime promises. And the top layer, the prize of the collection, was often a buffalo robe. Don't let the name fool you. It was not something to serve hors d'oeuvres on. It was the thick, nearly waterproof pelt of a bison, and when draped over a sleeping child, could trick them into thinking they had perhaps become one with the herd. These robes were so coveted that some pioneers traded entire barrels of flour or rifles for them. Because, as it turns out, when a blizzard blows through at 3 a.m., nobody's dreaming of pie crust. They're dreaming of not freezing to death. Even the placement inside the wagon mattered. Families learned to sleep close, really close. Personal space wasn't a concept. It was a luxury that waited patiently on the far side of the Mississippi. You might sleep 3 deep under quilts, with the smallest child nestled in the center, like the warm, squeaky core of a pioneer cinnamon roll. Snoring wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Symphonic evidence of survival. On especially brutal nights, the oxen, those stoic snorting troopers, might even be brought close to the wagon to share radiant body heat. Their breath, rising in plumes like sleepy ghost whispers, would make halos in the air as if the earth itself were attempting to exhale some warmth. Of course, the prairie winds required their own arrangements. Wagons were often circled, not just for protection from wolves or robbers, but to create a windbreak. Within those circles, tarps could be strung and extra canvas battened down tight, creating a little village of cold-defying cocoons, each one buzzing with the quiet symphony of bedtime sighs, the crackle of the dying fire, and the occasional whispered, "Did we forget the soapstone in the fire again?" And so, in firelight and frost, with beds built from hay and hides, in spaces huddled tighter than secrets, the families settled, grateful for stones, quilts, and the deep, enduring warmth of not being alone. Next time, we'll drift even deeper into the snug little world of pioneer slumber, toward the voices of bedtime tales passed gently from wagon to wagon, like warm biscuits before dawn. As night drew its curtain across the frozen expanse of the prairie plains, the wind sang its whistle through the wagon wheels like a ghost with a flair for dramatic entrances. the temperature dipped low enough to make the stars shiver. For pioneer families who were long past the novelty of roughing it, the real question was not how to keep spirits lifted, but how to keep their toes. The key player in this nightly survival ballet, the unassuming buffalo robe. Ah yes, the buffalo robe, thicker than a gossip at Sunday service and warmer than a secret shared beside a fire. Sewn from the hide of the great bison, these robes were more than luxurious. They were life-saving. When properly prepared and softened, usually through a delightful mix of scraping, stretching, and occasionally chewing, a buffalo robe could trap body heat like a loyal friend spooning you through the worst blizzard since last March. Children were rolled into them like burritos with the ends tucked under, while grown folk would layer multiple robes and then lie very still, hoping their fellow sleepers didn't snore through their nose hair. The Wagon families weren't just inventing coziness. They were perfecting it with whatever nature was willing to lend them. But precious as buffalo robes were, they weren't exactly reusable in large numbers. 1 robe per person, 2 if you had excellent trading connections or suspiciously friendly relations with a trapper. So, when more warmth was needed, and oh, it often was, families turned to another time-tested tool, the bed warming pan, or its more practical frontier cousin, the heated brick. Gathered from the fire before bedtime, smooth, river stones or fireplace bricks were lovingly wrapped in cloth, sometimes flannel, sometimes a child's slightly damp sock. Dreams and practicality both considered. These homemade heaters were slipped under feather ticks, if one were fancy, or hay mattresses, if one were not, radiating a gentle glow of comfort through the long, icy night. The soul might love poetry, but frozen feet loved thermodynamics. Then there was the stove, cast iron and ornery, yet effective. Families fortunate enough to own a Franklin stove or a smaller box stove installed it smack in the middle of a converted wagon or a rough log cabin. A carefully stoked fire could warm the air long enough to tempt fingers out of mittens. Tea kettles sputtered on top, and socks dangled from nails hammered into the wall with such casual ambition they might have believed themselves to be interior decorators. Still, not every wagon had the structural girth or the judicial approval to host a stove indoors, which meant leaning into other tactics, like the ever-popular shared body heat. It's a curious thing, how fast propriety erodes beneath a howling wind. Children pressed close to their parents. Grandparents slept beside cousins. Husbands and wives, even those who'd argued about stew thickness mere hours earlier, now couldn't get close enough. If your nighttime neighbors were simply warm and didn't hog the buffalo robe, they might be more valuable than flour. And herein enters the unsung hero of frontier comfort. Flannel. Pioneers treasured flannel like gold sewn into sleeves. Petticoats, nightshirts, and long johns made of flannel offered the sort of warmth that inspired unspoken gratitude. They weren't just soft. They were the frontier equivalent of being hugged by someone who smelled faintly of cinnamon and practicality. Wool, too, had its moment. It was scratchier, yes, and carried with it the persistent aroma of well-travelled sheep, but it performed valiantly. A well-knit wool sock might not get its own ballad, but it deserved one. Of course, warmth was more than just science. It was also about ritual, singing by the hearth until cheeks flushed, telling stories until someone's eyelids drooped like heavy curtains. One child once described a winter bedtime as crawling into a sleepy oven full of people. A bizarre yet strangely accurate portrait of the Opelousas family, staying warm through camaraderie, compression, and the occasional foot in the ribs. And so they endured, huddled beneath hides, feeding stoves, swapping warmth and snores beneath a sky so wide and frostbitten, it frizzed your hair just by looking at it. Nightfall on the frontier was neither quiet nor merciful, but it did draw families close, literally and figuratively. Next came the morning, not yet, but someday, the part where frost would glitter on the inside of wagon windows, and someone would rise first, always first, to coax life from the embers again. But for now, it was enough to drift beneath buffalo robes, half listening to the stove's creak and the wind's lullaby, as something curious about cooking stoves and midnight biscuits begins to stir. As the wind rattled the canvas flaps of a Conestoga wagon, and frost traced lace-like patterns across the windowless folds, life inside wasn't quite the frosty misery you might expect. No central heating, of course. Those wouldn't arrive until the late 19th century, and only for the exceptionally lucky with extra nickels to rub together. But before radiators, air vents, or thermostats, pioneer families had their own systems for not freezing stiff during the worst of prairie winters. Systems that were practical, resourceful, and occasionally, accidentally, hilarious. Picture this: a family of 6, a baby, a cranky dog named Beans, and a small mountain of quilts inside a wagon, no wider than your average broom closet. The wind howls outside like a harmonica possessed by a ghost, but inside, bodies are layered so close they cancel out personal space entirely. You didn't just sleep next to Ma and Pa. You became part of one large snoring entity known colloquially as the family lump. If someone rolled over, everyone rolled over. And yet, no one froze. A primary line of defense was the bedrock of the frontier. Body heat, simple, reliable, and generated in abundance by children, especially those who forgot to bathe. Layers of homemade quilts made from old dresses, wool scraps, and burlap served as the insulation. Some were stuffed with down feathers, others with raw wool, and in the hardest times, dried corn husks. Yes, nothing whispers cozy warmth quite like a crunchy blanket filled with salad ingredients. Wagons were also commonly chinked. Yes, a weird-sounding word that just means sealing up drafts with cloth, grass, or near-heroic amounts of mud smeared into cracks. Families would roll up rags and tuck them in every nook where the cold might sneak in. This seemed to do more for psychological warmth than actual temperature regulation. But consider it frontier feng shui. Now, as much as we love the image of everyone bundled under quilts, whispering bedtime tales by candlelight, it wasn't always quite that idyllic. Candles, while atmospheric, were dangerous. One misplaced elbow, and you weren't warming your feet, you were lighting your wagon on fire. So most families used lanterns with glass chimneys, or, if they were really fancy, a tin reflector lamp hung up high, casting shadows that made even Beans the dog appear dramatic and mysterious. Fires inside the wagon were a big old no-no. Unless, of course, someone had built one of those rare and extravagant stoves on wheels. These mobile hearths were the frontier equivalent of having heated seats. But most travelers feared setting their only shelter ablaze, so fires remained outside, in earthen pits or small dugouts when camp was set. To extend the nighttime warmth, many clever pioneers turned to a solution adored since medieval times: the hot brick. Before turning in, someone, usually the person least likely to grumble, went outside, pulled a brick or large stone from the fire, carefully wrapped it in cloth or wool, and tucked it near the feet under the bedding. This primitive space heater lasted about as long as the children's lullabies, but it made all the difference in those opening, shiver-prone hours of sleep. For extra insulation, many wagons had a second, inner covering, a canvas dome under the outer layer to trap heat. A tent inside a wagon, essentially. It was like glamping, only with fewer Instagram opportunities and more cow pies. Speaking of cows, they were another not-so-secret warming trick. If a family slept in or near a barn, or more accurately, if the wagon was stuck parked inside a makeshift corral, the radiant heat from livestock could taxonomically classify as comfy. A couple cows, a horse or two, and a thick layer of hay. That was it, the prairie's answer to radiant floor heating. Just keep in mind that cows do snore, loudly, and they don't tend to share the covers. Wool, as always, was the darling of the winters. Woolen hats, mittens, undergarments that could scratch emotion from stone. Even babies were swaddled in knitted layers tighter than a banker's purse strings. Wool trapper socks were often homemade, passed down, and only slightly less precious than the family Bible. And for those lucky enough to bed down near a sod hut or a dugout, a literal hole in the ground lined with mud, their nights were often surprisingly warmer than those in wooden cabins or wagons. Earth, it turns out, makes for a better insulator than canvas and hope. By morning, the frost may have stiffened the air, but not the spirits. Awakening in a nest of cousins and quilts, to the smell of cornbread cooked over last night's embers, life seemed not only survivable, but rich in the ways that mattered. And as dawn's light began to prise open the prairie sky, the family lump stirred once more, ready to face another frigid day with the same medicine that saw them through the night. Warmth born of closeness, cleverness, and quilts. And in that delicate hour when dreams still linger and frost begins to melt from the breath of the waking world, something else stirred, a new idea, a quiet innovation, perhaps the warmest secret of all. As the last embers of our covered wagon campfire flicker against the frostbitten dark, and prairie winds hush their howling into lullabies, we come to what might be the warmest moment of all, not from a fire nor a buffalo robe, but from the quietly heroic human stubbornness that refused to freeze. You see, after all the feather-stuffed ticks and makeshift tent stoves, after the hot bricks passed around like sacred relics and the furious foot-stomping rituals that could qualify as prairie tap dance, what truly kept those wagon families warm, on the bleakest of nights snuggled beneath frozen canvas, was the art of communal huddling and good old-fashioned ingenuity served with a generous side of stubborn optimism. Picture it. A wagon interior so compact it made modern studio apartments feel like palaces. A space packed tighter than a barrel of molasses in January, layered with wool, hay, fur, and sleeping limbs. Amid the sleepy grumbles, perhaps a stray knee in someone's rib, and a toddler who insisted on kicking like a caffeinated frog, warmth was not a luxury. It was a shared responsibility. Wagons became ecosystems. If you were lucky, you'd have 4 children, a dog with thick fur and poor manners, a small iron stove bolted to the wagon floor, which often threatened to tumble over at the first sharp turn, and an extra aunt or two knew how to quilt like their lives depended on it, because, frankly, they did. One famed warming method among particularly inventive travelers was the creation of heat traps. Now, before you imagine anything elaborate, a heat trap on the frontier was essentially a person-shaped burrito made of buffalo robes, with the belief that if you bundled tightly enough, your body heat would bounce back with gratitude. Some pioneers swore by lining their wagons with newspaper, yes, newspaper, not to catch up on last week's cattle prices, but because the air bubbles in the paper could trap heat. It didn't hurt that they could fall asleep mid-sentence trying to read an article by flickering lantern light, which was a tranquilizer of sorts. Still, others embraced one of nature's greatest inventions, the hot potato. Real hot potatoes. You'd cook them in the coals, wrap them in scraps of cloth or a mitten you no longer liked, and use them as pocket warmers, foot warmers, or emergency midnight snacks. Though results varied depending on whether the potato survived the trampling of little feet during the night. And of course, there were bedfellows, kinfolk-turned space heaters. If you've ever, tried sleeping beside a human furnace named Earl, who snored like a buffalo in a wind tunnel, you know there's a high cost for that warmth. But back then, chilly toes took precedence over gentle acoustics. Then there was the secret weapon, body heat maximization through story time. Families told stories not just as a luxury of leisure, but as a means of survival, gathering close under the quilts, swapping tales of distant lands or old country mischief, giggling over mistakes from the trail. Laughter, it turns out, is thermogenic. And perhaps the most powerful hearth is human connection. Funny how remembering the time Uncle Jed fell face first into a snowdrift while trying to warm his backside has the ability to heat a wagon better than most stoves. Not to say it was always merry. The cold could be cruel. There were frostbite mornings, teeth that rattled before eyes had opened, and long nights when the wind sang a song none dared harmonize with. There were losses and longings and a chill so deep it whispered questions about one's sanity. But resilience has its own warmth. Life on the trail taught our wagon families to become part architect, part naturalist, part stoic comedian. Who else could repurpose a tin pie plate into a snow scoop, a hat liner, and, if you banged it just right, a warning gong for ornery raccoons? As the last great frost of that bitter prairie season melted into spring, it said the wagon folks didn't immediately shed their layers, not for chill's sake, but because every scarf, every patchwork quilt, every singed mitten bore the softness of survival. They told one another, come warmer days, that the cold had only visited, but warmth they carried within. And now, as your own covers tug a little higher around your shoulders and your breath becomes slower, you can rest easy knowing that even in the unlikeliest places, even in a snowbound wooden box on wheels, people found warmth in heat and in heart. And tonight, so do you. Sleep well, traveller. The snow has stopped, the fire's low, and your story is safe for now.